guys, it's Victoria, and I'm back with another episode of You All Right. This is the first episode of my podcast, technically. I wouldn't really include the intro into this, but one of the first episodes that I wanted to do is kind of talking about why dating in your 30s is actually easier. I know it sounds like a crazy statement, especially to my millennial girls, but I'll get into why in just a second. But besides that, kind of the flow of things for the next couple months really is to be determined. Would I like a host or a co-host on here? Absolutely. Will that happen? I'm not sure. I mean, I think it'd be cool to have a bunch of people come on as guests and be able to discuss these topics with me and kind of rotate a bunch and see how that goes. And maybe one will stick and maybe it'll just be me. But over the course of the next couple months, I hope that you get to build some sort of, audible relationship with me. Of course, you can follow me on all my socials at the Daily Victoria. I'm cooler on TikTok, not as cool on Instagram, but either way, that's where you can find me, where I talk about anything and everything. And like anyone who starts a podcast, I love to talk. So pretty easy for me. So let's start off this episode like I would any episode, is to ask the question, you all right? Personally, I'm doing fine. I'm here in the rainy Florida currently. Not a big fan of the hot weather. Too hot for me. I love seasons. I love cold weather. I love being in sweaters. I could go on forever about it, but that's not what this episode is about. But just kind of want to kind of give you a little insight, a little backstory of myself currently. But again, make sure you're asking yourself this all the time as well. You all right? So for today's episode on why dating in your 30s is actually easier, I definitely can simplify it into one statement. In your 30s, my time is precious, right? So something that we do in our 20s is waste a lot of time because we have it, to be honest with you. We spend a lot of time with people who might not actually be beneficial for our future. And this is something, that's not a horrible thing because of course you learn from every friendship, every relationship, but it's just something that you do because time isn't of the essence as it is more in your 30s. At least that's how I feel. Again, these are all my opinions. Something that you start to feel as you get older is, that your time is precious, that it's limited. And in your 20s, it kind of seems like the world is your oyster and you have all the time in the world, which you do. And when you're in your late 20s and 30s, your goals of what you want to achieve and do in the next few years is different than what it was when you were 21. And that's normal. But because your goals are different, your timelines are different, and what you want to do in those timelines are completely different. And for the most part, they're bigger goals that really need as much time as possible to flourish and grow. And when you're in your 20s, I think it's important that, you date as much as possible because you'll never know what you want if you don't get to meet it and see it, or what you don't want until you get to meet it and see it. And I mean, this is just my personal opinion. Again, I'm sure people who are in long-term or have been in long-term relationships in their 20s might disagree. Maybe a good medium of this, but I think a lot of people who stay in long-term relationships, especially in their 20s, might regret it later that they spent such a youthful time just with one person and not having the ability to know what else is out there. On top of that, it makes dating to them seem scarier once they get out of that long-term relationship. Whereas when I was in my 20s, I didn't really have anything too serious or too solid. I think the most I spent with someone was like on and off for 2 years. And I do regret not having something a little bit more meaningful to show me how to nurture and take care of a romantic relationship. But I definitely did that with my friendships because they were all I had. And I will never take that back at all because I loved what I got to learn from my experiences. I don't know if you can hear, but it's thundering outside, so it's a little scary. Yes, I do break into a British accent sometimes. But again, so when I'm talking about, goals and timelines being different from your 20s and 30s, what are these goals that these 30-year-olds have that are so different than these 20-year-olds? I think it seems pretty obvious though, settling down, buying a house, creating a family, being financially stable, and furthering your career, right? But half of those goals really depend upon relationships with other people, on romantic relationships. So why is it easier when you date in your 30s? Well, from my perspective, here's why. So when you go on a date, within the first date or two, you should know if someone has the same goals as you, right? This includes their timeline. This includes, how they see their next couple of years going. And if you don't know, just ask them, right? It's easier to ask these questions rather than get more attached down the line to find out the hard truth. You know how many times I had to deny second or third dates because I knew these guys didn't want the same future with me, and I didn't know why they kept wanting to see me. It was very, very strange. I mean, one can assume why, but I remember, so basically, once I got out of this relationship with this guy in London, after a while, after kind of healing and just going out on my own, I started dating again. And all of these dates, were great in the sense that I got to learn something from them, but a lot of them are kind of just having to like filter through each of the guys because our goals didn't line up and our futures didn't line up, and that's fine. But one guy I knew by the first or second date didn't want kids, and kids are super important to me. So I thought, as much as this would be a great time, what's the point if, I see myself in a few years having a family and he doesn't? I don't want to get emotionally attached. I mean, because after even a couple of dates, you start feeling for these people a lot. So I wanted to, nip it in the bud. But of course they come back. They always do. I remember this other guy who clearly didn't have the same goals as me as well. He asked me on like a second or third date. I don't remember why. And this is after we had discussed kind of what we wanted and they didn't align. And I remember I sat down on the date and I said, so why am I here? Why are we having this conversation? I didn't expect that his goals would have changed all of a sudden. But he said, because I was like, we aren't looking for the same thing. And he said, I know, I just really enjoyed talking to you. I was like, please leave me alone. Like, I am not your therapist. A lot of these guys, when you sort through them, unfortunately, especially when they're older, they haven't had the time to deal with all their emotions. They haven't ever had any sort of therapy. And then they kind of just lay it on you. And you're like, no, goodbye. Go see a therapist. I can't help you out with your life problems. As much as it's nice spending time with you, I'm not here to like unpack your life. We're here to just get to know each other, have fun, and discuss a future. But again, because I asked these questions so early on, I didn't get emotionally invested in these guys, and it wasn't a waste of time. I just got to meet them, get to know who they were, and once I found out, okay, listen, I'm attracted to you, you have a great personality, but you don't see yourself with getting married, or you don't see yourself with kids, it's going to be a no for me. So it just became easier because you're cutting through the bullshit that most 20-year-olds leave as a mystery and over romanticize. I don't know if you guys do this, but I definitely did this in my 20s, and it's honestly so unhealthy that you can speak to someone in their 20s and ask them, so why are they staying with someone that they don't see a future with? And they say it's because they're comfortable or hope something will change. And let me tell you, I feel like this is fact by now. You can't change someone. You can't change a person. Yes, a person can change for themselves, but you cannot create that change. It has to come from them. And honestly, I was guilty of this in my 20s too. I stayed with guys that I knew weren't good for me, weren't beneficial for me, were a little toxic, or maybe were leading me on in certain ways. And I just over romanticized what we had or what it was going to be and held on to any sort of like sparkling glimmer of hope. And also, I didn't ask the proper questions to get these answers because I didn't want to know the answer, because of course I was probably in a little bit of a denial, right? So I mean, it's like in your 20s, I think you wish and you pray and you hope for these relationships to be these most amazing things. And I don't know if I'm here to block you from those experiences, because I do think they're beneficial to learn how am I going to try and say this? They are beneficial for you in a way to learn this all by yourself instead of hearing it from me. But at the same time, if you really want to just, I don't know, enjoy your 20s, I would just say casually date, have some fun, meet some people. If you meet the right person, then fine, definitely spend time with them and date them. But make sure that you're not wasting your time, because there are people that I know who've been in 5-10 year long relationships and now are breaking up in their 30s because they knew at the end of the day they weren't going to be with that person forever. And I feel bad for them because I know they've missed out on that whole decade that they could have had, seeing what was out there. Now instead they're in a rush trying to find like the next person to date and marry, which is wild. But again, this is why dating in your 30s is so much easier, because your time is precious and you don't let things get over romanticized. You see things for what they actually are, and you see people for who they actually are instead of what you wish they were. if that makes sense. Now, let me say this, it's not all rainbows and butterflies also dating in your 30s. Some things aren't easier. Like, you have to shift through a lot of shitty people, a lot of different, for me, men that will not be a good match for you or do not align with your lifelong goals. So yeah, I had to go on a couple of dates here and there with different people to realize, okay, this is not going to be a good fit. And you'll deal with men who are your age or even older who you would assume, okay, well, they must be ready for the same things I am. They're my age, they're a couple years older, we must have the same goals, right? But in fact, these guys rather date a 20-year-old who's not ready to settle down rather than a 30-year-old who is, because they're not there. They're not ready. As we've seen from our parents' generation versus our generation, is that unfortunately the timelines have been pushed up. And for men, that's a little bit easier because they're not in this fertile stage of childbearing, whereas women will unfortunately always feel this pressure to be in the childbearing, to settle down in the childbearing stages so we can have healthy children. It's not really that selfish of an ask, is because we want to make sure, for the most part, some of us who do want to be mothers and have kids ourselves, this is something that is important to us. And unfortunately, the men that are our age don't always match that. So usually you have to date older, but there will be these few younger boys now. There will be younger men who are interested in you and that they promise deep down inside that they're looking for the same exact things that you are. But sometimes it feels like an act, and sometimes it feels like overacting, like they're trying to portray this manly role to you when they're in fact not, for the most part. Because I feel like sometimes they're just talking up a bunch of air. So there'll be these young guys you'll have great conversations with, you'll have a great time, you'll go out and have a blast, and they might say to you that they want this timeline that you want, but sometimes it's really hard to trust because it just seems unreasonable for you dating someone in their mid to late 20s when you're in your early 30s. And for them to actually want the same things as you just seems a little unreasonable. I wouldn't say fully give up on those guys, but just stay cautious. It's hard to trust these youthful creatures, honestly, because they might give you the world and then ditch you the next day, right? They might think that they're ready and all of a sudden run for the hills. So kind of this is just a little bit about pros and the cons of dating in your 30s. But at the end of the day, the thing is, it is easier because your time is precious. You become more of a romantic and rather than a realist. And it's not really that horrible being a realist. You're just helping yourself and protecting yourself to make sure that, your goals are met and your needs are met. And it's good. So girls, let me just tell you, is that when you go on dates in your 30s, having conversations about family, having conversations about settling down or buying a house or things like that actually become the norm. So as much as they are kind of a little weird to be asking in your 20s, they aren't that weird. They're pretty normal conversation in your 30s. And don't be afraid to ask those questions either. Now, if you're in your early 20s, please don't tell me you're trying to settle down. I'm not going to say this advice you should be using now because I don't think you should. I think you should be out there having a blast and meeting everyone and anyone. But if you're in your mid to late 20s and you promise me you've done it all, you've seen it all, and now you just want to settle down and have kids, then fine. Don't be afraid to ask these questions, about long-term goals. I think the key takeaway here is don't over-romanticize the relationship until you know the facts, until you know that this has long-term potential. This is my advice, and this is my take on why dating is easier in your 30s, and it's because it's really cut and dry, and you're really more self-centered and focused on your goals and your timelines and making sure that someone aligns up to that rather than holding on to the first thing that gives you attention. And I think you become more aware of your worth as well. Whereas maybe sometimes in your 20s, you're a little bit insecure and you kind of live that out through men or things to make you feel like you're worth something. But in your 30s, you know your worth, and a man just kind of meet you there. I also want to add that this is, again, from my perspective, just based on the 32 years of experience that I've had, and also just stories from friends or, complaints from friends, or just kind of a collection of thoughts from a bunch of different people and different experiences combined into one. So no matter if you're in your 20s or your 30s and even your teens, remember that your time is precious, and always use your worth to know whether or not your time should be wasted or if it's being well used. So I do plan on discussing more and more about this in the whole relationship and dating part and friendship part of this podcast. I am no dating expert and I do not claim to be, but I think that if I had a younger sister, this might be the things that I tell her. These are the things that my friends who are just turning 30 discuss with me, and I like to share my thoughts on it because a lot of the time people ask me, well, how are you so calm about everything? Aren't you worried about not being able to find someone or etc.? And I have to say, is like, if I was worried, I mean, I'd be stressed out all the time. So I have to choose not being worried about this sort of thing. But I also know why I'm not worried is because the way them going about it to me is right and to me is a healthier way. Whereas they're choosing someone, holding on to them, latching on to them, being obsessed with them, and then it not working out, and them, heartbroken and not knowing how to move on. Whereas I think that knowing that my time is precious and knowing my worth, I've come to a place of really good contentness and calm, whereas I'm happy with myself. And this I will discuss in another podcast about self-love, self-worth, and how that's brought me so much calm over my life, and where it's made me not feel the need to date unless I really feel it's not necessary but beneficial for me. And yeah, there's more to come about that. And again, I just wanted to reiterate that I'm not a dating expert, but the future podcast definitely I think will be a little bit longer than this. This is me still getting my feet wet, getting used to the whole talking to myself thing. And hopefully if I do have someone else chime in with me, it might be a little bit, easier to do a little bit longer of a podcast. But I don't want to rant to you about, for another 15 minutes about dating advice. Whereas I'm not the expert. I'm just providing my opinion based on experience for you. But as always, make sure that you are all right. Check in with yourself. And also just know your worth and know that your time is precious. And I'll see you in the next episode next Tuesday. Have a good one.